Hello and welcome to Tyler Talks, and today I have a brand new series for you guys. Today we are going to be introducing the Beginner's Guide series. And before you're wondering, and before I really get into this video, I just want to break down what you can expect from this series, what kind of stuff you should be looking for, and what kind of stuff I'm going to be including in it. So what's this series about? Basically, as a teacher, my goal as an educator to my students is to break down books so they're accessible for them, and these could be any types of books. They could be challenging, they could be not challenging, they could be classics, they can be contemporary. Really, it's just the idea of giving them information about the book before they go into it so it's less daunting, it's less overwhelming. And that's ultimately what I want to do with this series here today. I want to just be breaking down new books and having a discussion with them, and it could be any type of books. It could be classics, it could be contemporary, it could be really anything. Just breaking down key elements of the book, non-spoiler, and making it more accessible and less daunting for everyone. So what kind of books will I be talking about? Well, I've already said I'll be talking about classics and contemporary, and it really is just anything that piques my interest. Today, as you can view from my title, we are actually talking about Of Human Bondage by Somerset Maugham, which is a classic modernist novel, but I do want to talk about more contemporary stuff. I'd love to do a video on 1Q84 if I ever want to tackle that book again. These books don't have to be super large in length. They can be a couple hundred pages. I just think if they're a book worth checking out, I want to make a video about them, and I want people to read them and give me their opinions about them. Again, like I said before, this is going to be a non-spoiler video. The spoiler section will come later at the end, which I will give you warnings about. But really, if you have read the book, if you have not read the book, I want everyone to come in and just give me their opinions about it. This is supposed to be an open discussion platform, and I hope I can create that for you. So as I said before, today we are talking about Of Human Bondage by Somerset Maugham. So first, I want to break down this video into about 5 different sections. The first section is this. Basically, it's the historical context surrounding the novel. It's everything that was occurring, or at least the main things that were occurring when the novel was written, major events that take place during the novel, major influences, really anything at all. Of Human Bondage is a modernist novel. Somerset Maugham was a modernist author. Modernism was a philosophical and art movement basically around the late 19th, early 20th century that basically centered around taking things that were traditional and experimenting with them in ways that often more contemporary and new values and ideas during the time. These new values and ideas often had to do with industrialization, urbanization, technology, war. At the time this book was written, there's the looming World War I, or the Great War at the time. Basically, it was artists trying to distance themselves from the traditional, and because they considered it outdated with the ever-changing society. It was really centered around the idea of experimentation, whether that be with science or new art forms or new structures or really anything. There was also the looming educational reform in England, which Maugham was greatly affected by during this time. This is basically when religion was a core emphasis and dogma of all education, and schools started to move away from teaching religion, moral philosophy, and mathematics and classical literature to what was deemed as useful knowledge. What was deemed to be useful knowledge was basically the stuff that was deemed to reflect the changing industrial world. So that could be applied science, applied engineering, really anything that was hands-on and applicable. There is also the looming sense of World War I in the outskirts of the politics of this book. World War I is mentioned a few times, or the potential of conflict is mentioned a few times in Maugham's story. That's basically modernism in a very, 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 very rapid retelling of it. It has a long history and a long bunch of different stuff, and this book even has more influences. I just kind of want to give you guys a surface level for everything. So, who was Somerset Maugham? Well, if you didn't know anything about this book or have never read it, this book is semi-autobiographical, which means that some aspects of Maugham's life are directly represented in the book. Now, Maugham is on record by saying that this book is somewhat autobiographical with a lot of stuff made up for fiction, but if you look at who he was as an individual, it seems more like a lot of his ideas and values and histories are implemented into this. Basically, Maugham's life story is that he was orphaned by about 10 years old. His mother died when he was 8 and his father 2 years later, and he was sent to live with a cold and distant and mean uncle. And then, basically, after he went to live with his uncle, he then was sent to a boarding school. And at a certain point, he hated the boarding school so much because of his bully, because of his stammer. He ended up leaving his boarding school and studying in Germany. And after studying in Germany, he came back and tried his hand in accounting. And after accounting fell through, he eventually tried to work in medicine for 5 years. It was then in 1897 that he published his first novel, Lisa of Lambeth, and that kind of took off, and then that earned him notoriety as a writer. W. Somerset Maugham was a writer, a playwright, and a short story writer. He was also, and this is where a lot of his writing and a lot of the stuff is very interesting, W. Somerset Maugham was potentially fully homosexual or bisexual. It is always good to know that kind of stuff going into it, because you have to take a look at when Somerset Maugham was living and writing, and he was living and writing during a time when that kind of that identity was looked down upon and often treated as horrific and a burden to society, and that stuff was hidden by Maugham. And I personally think it comes through a lot in his writing. When you read of Human Bondage, pay attention to how Maugham treats his male and female characters. What does he do with descriptions? What does he do with his prose? How does the main character of the story, interact differently with men and women? Somerset Maugham also identified as agnostic, and he was someone who was one of the most popular and well-regarded authors of his time. So what is this book about? Well, this book tells the story of Philip Carey. And Philip Carey is a young boy who is orphaned at a young age and who has a clubfoot. And if you think of a stammer, a clubfoot, you can think of the allusions there. You can also look at homosexuality in a clubfoot as kind of the same thing. But basically, the story is the adventures of Philip as he dabbles in art, in science, in finding his identity, and finding really everything. The story follows Philip as he goes to school, as he travels through Germany and Paris and London, and we experience him through his relationships, his trials, his tribulations, his successes, his failures. It's a coming-of-age story. It's a Bildungsroman. We watch Philip age and experience the world, and new things challenge him and change his ideologies and his dogma and his perceptions of reality and who he is. I wanted to tackle the writing style in this because I feel like when a book gets the stigma of a classic, people often think of this flowery and verbose language that is difficult to read and it's difficult to ascertain what exactly is being said. And I don't want to say that Of Human Bondage doesn't have any of those moments, because it does, but Maugham tried to write as succinctly and clearly as possible. The prose, the writing style, the language is very simple for the time it was written, and that makes it incredibly accessible. This book is one of the more accessible classics you can find. The writing style is direct, and it's very, very apparent with what is being said. There are moments when characters will go on long tirades about art and artists and painters and really everything, and it's pages long, and there are times when it can drag, and even for me, someone who has read a lot and who's experienced a lot, it can drag. And I had difficulties sometimes where I was automatically just kind of scanning stuff, and I realized I hadn't gathered any of the information, and my eyes kind of glossed over, and I'm like, okay, let's keep going, let's get back to the dialogue. That happens to me too. It happens in this one, but just know the dialogue and the language and the descriptions and the prose as a whole is incredibly accessible. The book is also about 660 pages with this edition. That shouldn't seem too daunting. This book flies by, and I think the book is paced really well between different ages in Philip's life and different interactions with people. The book's accessible is what I'm trying to say. Is anyone who is interested in classics, I think this is a really great entry point into modernist literature, into a coming-of-age literary story. I think it's really great, and the writing style is purposely made this way for everyone to read. So what edition should you buy for this? Typically, when I talk about a book that isn't written in English, this will be a much more prevalent discussion because you have to deal with translations, and different publishing companies translate things in different types of way. But this thing was written in English, and therefore, I just kind of want to point you in a few different directions for where you can buy this book, what kind of publishing company produces kind of the best and most favorable version of this book, and which one is often the most accessible. I personally read the Barnes & Noble's Classic Edition. It comes with a great bunch of footnotes and individual information at the end. The font isn't too small and the length isn't too big, and the book size is pretty good. Based on my own individual research, there does tend to be one version of this book that people tend to rate a little bit lower than others, and that's the Signet Classics edition. Based on a couple of reviews, it seems like the font is very, very small, which if you're someone who wants to get into this kind of stuff, and you're like me and I hate small font, that can be definitely a burden that is too difficult to overcome. You might get used to it, but I don't want to put you in a position where you're buying that right off the bat and you get stuck not reading a book that is just looks daunting. I'm also someone who tries to avoid buying on Amazon as much as I can. So if you can avoid it, don't buy on Amazon. I'm going to put a few used bookseller links in the description where you can buy copies from. If you want to buy the cheapest version of this book from the cheapest website, go to a website called Thrift Books. I'll put a link in the description down below. I have personally purchased books from there before. Same with Mark, same with Matt, and everything has come in high quality and everything has come in good condition, and I can vouch for their services. The books you're going to find there are going to range anywhere from $4 to $6, and there are multiple mass paperback versions of it, and you can even find a Barnes & Noble Classic Edition for about $6. I bought this book at Barnes & Noble's, and I paid about $13 for it. And most other non-used bookseller websites are going to charge around the same $12 to $14. If you are someone like me who likes to buy new kind of versions, I like to be the first one to I own this. This is mine. I have two websites for you. First, you can go directly to Penguin Publishing House and buy the book from there. There's also this website, which I've used before and which I love, called bookshop.org. I'm not sponsored by any of these people, I just want to clarify. But basically, bookshop.org is a website that donates some of its profits to used bookstores around the country. From this website, they are the Penguin Classics editions, which means you can either buy directly from the publisher or buy from a company that tends to support used bookstores. It's not like an ethics thing, I just think, multiple different options. So, like I said before at the end of my last video, my goal is to make this channel a discussion-based channel, and at the end of these beginner's guides, I want to include a discussion in some form. Sometimes I'm going to try to have people who have read the book and can come on and talk about it. Sometimes it'll just be me giving you my own thoughts about it. And today, we actually have a very special guest. You know him very well. That man is Mark. Mark will be coming on and we'll be talking about this book and his own experiences with it. We are going to start off on a non-spoiler section, and then we're going to be getting to a more spoiler section as a whole. The clips you're about to see are only a small section of the discussion that we had. I will be uploading a separate video where I upload the entire discussion, and this one is really just to give you a sense of hey, if I haven't sold you on this book in any capacity, here is a direct hand account from someone else who might be able to. Or hey, here are my own personal thoughts that are not part of these sections. This discussion section is really just supposed to be open and free and fun. So, Mark, thank you for joining me. Welcome. You were actually the person who recommended this book to me. And before we really got into a spoiler section, I just kind of wanted to get a couple quick opinions about what you thought about the book, really your history with it. So how'd you discover this book? What made you want to read it? Let's go with that.
So I discovered this book because just being on the internet, I found there is this list out there called the Hemingway list. And it's a list of 14 novels and 2 short stories that were Hemingway's either favorite books or books he would recommend to aspiring authors. Not that I'm an aspiring author, but because I was curious that I read it, I found this list. And one of the titles was Of Human Bondage. And I was like, that is a weird title. I don't know what that means.
Yeah.
But it intrigued me. And this was July 2020. And then September 2020, I'm in Barnes & Noble. And I'm walking down the aisle, just skimming the shelves. And I see Of Human Bondage. And I was like, oh, it's a classic in the Barnes & Noble library. So I bought it on that whim, knowing that Hemingway liked it. And I read it in probably October, and it was one of the greatest reading experiences of my life so far. The book it reached a point for me where it's the story of Philip Carey. I think you've already talked about this. Philip Carey growing up in the world as a young man, and there reaches a point in the book where Philip Carey is my age in the book, and some of his thoughts, not all of them, but some of them were almost ones that I've had before. And so it was almost the fourth wall broke in
Yep.
the book where I was like, I sort of felt like I was reading myself
Yep.
in a way, in a weird way, not like in a complete way, but once I reached that point where I was like, oh wow, this is like a character I really identify with.
Yep.
It was like it was almost as if I was reading a book about not exactly myself, but I was
Yeah.
so dearly invested in the story by that point.
Yeah.
And it just like it reached like this different level, this like different reading experience for me.
Absolutely.
So
I mean, it's we often view books that have the stigma of being a classic as being this inaccessible kind of books that are for its time period. But Of Human Bondage is one of the first ones that I've read where nearly all of its major themes, and at least these are the thoughts and feelings of Philip Carey, feel almost very universal, kind of universal emotions that at least young men or just young people in general go through when they go through their 20s, because that is where a majority of the book is set, is through Philip Carey's 20s. And it's these like existential dread of like a place in a universe. It's like this constant question of like hypocrisy. It's this
yeah,
constant question of, do I want to be a cog in the machine or do I want to create? And it is this
yeah,
constant balance of like, what if I'm not talented enough to create? And
yes,
I think I am not as high on this book as you are. That does not mean that I don't like it. I actually think it's really great. But
yeah,
I reading it, I was like, I could see why it's like one of your favorite books of all time and one of the best
mhm,
reading experiences you've ever had.
yeah.
I'm curious to see. I have a few questions. Do you think this is a book that you could see yourself revisiting when you're, say, in your 30s or your 40s and it having the same impact that it had on you when you're in your 20s now?
That's a good question. I when I finished the book, I had already pictured like, or I thought about when am I going to revisit this, and it will probably be another like 20 or 30 years before I feel confident, not confident enough, but I think I'll have acquired enough life experience to revisit the story and to view things in retrospect and really observe like it, because reading the book would tell me about like where I felt in life when I was reading the book
Yeah.
originally, and just to like be like, oh wow, that's how it was, I
Yeah.
guess. I don't know. That's a weird way of describing it, but um, I think this there's so much life experience packed into this book.
Yeah.
And Maugham himself said he didn't. He almost wrote it when he was 23, but it was like subpar. And then it wasn't until he was 38 after he acquired more life experience in order
Yeah.
to write the story.
Yeah.
So I sort of feel the same way in regards to reading it. I
Yeah.
think I need because I think by the end of the novel, Philip Carey is third in his early 30s or something like that.
Late 20s, early 30s. Yeah.
Late 20s, early
Yeah, he's
30s.
30, I believe, by the time he graduated medicine. Yes.
Yes. But like the final page of the book, he's in his early 30s or
I
something.
believe, yeah, I believe you're correct.
So maybe it'd be cool to visit. Like I think it'd be cool to revisit the book when I'm Philip Carey's age at the end of the book.
Yep.
But also like again maybe when I'm like 50 or 60. I
Yeah.
think.
I
Um,
I'm definitely
yeah,
fascinated by how this book is going to age, at least for me, because there are certain points where it does feel like it is a book written by someone older, reflecting on the time when they're younger. Because if you're writing a book about your experiences during that own age, your own experiences are going to be biased. And that happens in this book, but it's also like very easily explained and backstoried because it feels like someone who's addressing, these are my circumstances, these are my biases, here is where I'm coming from, but I'm writing it from the perspective of someone who's gone through this already. This isn't
yeah,
someone who's like, there's a new trial and tribulation. It doesn't feel foreign, but rather a continuation of the sequence of events that's happened so far. And I
yeah.
think that's like a really masterful way of writing, but also something that I think is going to make this book age well. I mean, it's been out for over 100 years and it's still like one of the great modernist works. It's
Mhm.
considered Moe's masterpiece. Um,
Yes.
does anything even come close to that? Not, I have, this is the only one I've read by him.
Um, well, this is the only Moam that I've read, and but the late critic Harold Bloom said that The Moon and Sixpence. I think it was. He said The Moon and Sixpence was Moam's best novel, and I believe that was written in This is shortly after Of Human Bondage, so I think 1919,
Okay.
4 years after, and it's like 150 pages.
Wow. Okay.
So it'll be an interesting book to visit. But as far as I'm aware of, the Of Human Bondage is the only book of his printed as a classic, except for like his autobiography and stuff like that.
Okay.
Um,
Huh.
but
That's
yeah, I think maybe critics don't agree that it's his best book, but it appears that the public has
Yeah.
agreed that it's his best book.
It's kind of it's
So,
time. It's aged into his best book.
yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Because I want to just include this discussion at the end of the video. Mark, what advice would you give to new readers if they want to tackle Of Human Bondage? What would you recommend they do, approach, really anything?
So I know this is I think this for your channel, Tyler, this is a great idea, the approach to classics. I think this is probably I don't think there's any advice you need to read this book. I think you can just go and pick it up.
Yep.
I think this is just one of those cases where it's like a very accessible classic.
Yep.
I think this is a book. It's a remarkable book. It's written brilliantly and it tells this brilliant story. And I think if you're looking to get into classics, this might be a good starting point because this will give you a lot of confidence to tackle something harder. I mean, it's 700 pages nearly, and it's under the guise of being a classic. So
Yep.
I think when it comes to reading, building your momentum to get to something like the Divine Comedy, I think this is a great starting point.
Okay. So that's good to know. So this is going to be the end of our discussion for this beginner's guide video. But if you want to hear the rest of our discussion, I'm going to be publishing this in its own separate video. All right, guys, that brings us to the end of the video now. Thank you to Mark for joining us and talking about it and telling us why it's his second favorite book of all time. If you like this video or if you have any suggestions for what I can improve, what I can do different, if you want more research and more talking, I'm more than happy to make these videos 30 minutes long of just information. But if that's the case, let me know in the comment section down below. Make sure you like, subscribe, go check out Matt's channel where he announced a Road to Ulysses series where he's going to start reading some of James Joyce's stuff and talking about them. And go check out Mark's channel with whatever recent video that he just posted. So that brings us to the end of today's video. Thank you guys for watching and I'll see you soon.